Alright, hello everyone. Today I sort of wanted to discuss the UKIP fringe group, Christian soldiers, and whether or not they are fascist. Now, I want to discuss this simply so we can practice identifying fascism and the spread, and then maybe even see, even if something's not perfectly fascist, then it can still be, well, obviously, very, very problematic. I first sort of found out about Christian soldiers when I came across, well, it's a personal story and I don't want to give too much information, but I came across their newsletter, issue 2 of 2019. Do not worry, on my sake, no one who I am personally close to, thankfully, legitimately follows these things that I am now about to unfortunately describe. The newsletter is freely available, but I don't recommend that you get it, simply because we shouldn't really be encouraging people to read this nonsense, unless you want to make fun of it. If you want to make fun of it, you can probably find out how to get it somewhere. Apparently, they have the Christian soldiers hand them out at UKIP conferences. So the Christian soldiers, the first sort of mention of them I can find began in 2015, when they were blatantly homophobic, and then UKIP had to distance itself from them. Of course, UKIP did not totally cut ties with them, and instead said that these groups are authorized but not official. So they said they're not official, but they said that they're not really going to do anything about it. And then in 2017, the group was again featured prominently in the media because it was heavily present at the conference. It should be noted that despite it being a UKIP group, for example, on the back here it says, entitled, "Support UKIP and Safeguard Britain's Christian Freedoms and Heritage." They are still very much supportive of Nigel Farage, who has now gone on to form the Brexit Party. But, yes, as I said, I want to sort of compare this to the idea of sort of fascism, so I can sort of practice identifying fascist things and become more effective at seeing that. Partly also to highlight that there are fascistic elements in UKIP. Not that people weren't aware of it, but they may not have been aware of how blatant it was. Actually, Tommy Bloody Robinson's in UKIP. It's pretty blatant, but this makes it even more blatant. And then I feel like this kind of fascism comes from a different sort of direction from Tommy Robinson's brand of fascism. Whereas Tommy Robinson sort of appears to young, isolated men. This, from what I can gather, appeals very much to the older generations. Now, I'd like to start, I don't think they're fascist in the same sense that Hitler was a fascist, or even Mussolini was a fascism. Was a fascist, not a fascism. But I'm sort of going more in this idea of this more sort of popular sense of fascism, which people can sort of describe as sort of this totalitarian super nationalism. And then the sort of definition that I will be sort of using, will be the one by, that's sort of defined in Ur-Fascism by Umberto Eco, or Eco. I am not sure how to pronounce his name at all. I don't think I've actually ever heard it. I think I've only read it. But he made a 1995 essay, which is again called Ur-Fascism, and he makes a very good point in my opinion, that fascism varies a lot, so it's not possible to organise any sort of coherent, this is the one and only fascist ideology. Arguably the only one you can do that with is Mussolini's, because his was the first fascism, and I've seen, unfortunately, when I've unfortunately had to come across them on the internet, like Mussolini supportive fascists denying that Hitler was fascist. But we have to remember that although Mussolini influenced Hitler, it went both ways, and Mussolini was influenced heavily by Hitler. So, yes, so anyway, in Ur-Fascism, the author sort of sets 14 sort of properties of fascism that have sort of appeared many times in historical forms of fascism. And again, he says it's not possible to sort of like organise them into a coherent system, but when one of them sort of is present, it allows fascism to coagulate around it. And yeah, I think like sort of if you have many of these properties, you can safely say that it is fascist, or at least fascistic, or Ur-fascist maybe. But first is sort of the cult of tradition, which is sort of like the idea that it's cultural syncretism, so it blends together different sort of traditions and cultural practices, so that that have sort of thing, and it's a sort of this idealization of past knowledge and past thing, and then the idea is that all truth has been revealed by tradition, no new learning can occur, only further interpretation and refinement. For the Christian soldiers, this is very much the Bible. This is their main sort of tradition, but again, sort of along with it is the sort of idea of like the nation state of the United Kingdom, of Britain they refer to it, not the United Kingdom. And yes, they're very much obsessed with believing that the Bible is the sole source of truth. In the newsletter, which I have in my hands, they quote the Bible frequently. I just also like to note here, in this I'm not going to really focus on sort of trying to debunk religion or make fun of the, well, not make fun, but point out the problematic issues of religion. I'll point out when problematic things are said, probably, well, definitely, but I'm not really interested in debunking religion, as the term would go. I feel like that's been done and dusted many times, and in the modern context, that tends to lead into the hyper sort of like facts don't care about your feelings, internet, dark web, intellectual dark web, as it were. But yeah, I think this might be the idea of the sort of the cult of tradition is very well said by the sort of opening statement of, if we do not pray, if we do not fight, then all that is good, all that is ancient, all that we have to come to love as a Christian people will be no more. No shires, no nation, no Christian land, no truth, no rights, no freedoms, no independence, no democracy, no parliament, no sovereignty, no flag, no queen, no realm, no sceptre dial, no England. As darkness enfolds us and the light of freedom dies, there will only be a satanic, secular and EU tyranny. But we will pray and we will fight and all will be right. So you can see they sort of appeal to the nation state quite much. And then, of course, they actually appeal to England in this, as opposed to Britain. They do use Britain a lot of the time. But you can tell that there's sort of maybe some distancing with, because this is from a Protestant perspective, so they might want to reject a lot of the Irish on account of them being Catholic, and they may want to reject Scotland and Wales for other ideal reasons. And then this cult of tradition again is again exemplified by their logo, which is a very sort of crusadery shield and a sword behind the cross with their little motto underneath, shield of faith, sword of truth, underneath. So, yes, that's... Yeah, I feel like I'm dragging this out now, so we'll move on to the second point, or the second property of Ur-Fascism, is the rejection of modernism, which views the sort of development of sort of multiculturalism and the development of sort of knowledge and how we perceive the world and how the world is commonly perceived and talked about since the Enlightenment as sort of a descent into depravity. And then this is again this is exemplified by what am I saying? Yes, I'm trying to find the right bit. But again, they tend to decry multiculturalism and pluralism. So and then say that this has gone and pervade into society quite badly. Sorry, I was trying to find a thing like this. Yeah, from a writer, well, someone who's written in a letter, they decry that, yes, he, to quote Bill Greyer, whoever he is, who has written in, he has written that, I've just heard this morning on Radio 4, 8 a.m, that a couple, Lee and Susan Harris, want to ban Christian school assemblies in all schools, and this has now gone to the High Court. They claim that our society is now multicultural. They have received funding from the Humanist Society. Since 1944, by law, all schools were to have Christian teaching including in their assemblies, and Christianity has for centuries been part of our British culture, laws, the monarchy, parliament, and tradition. Christian teaching, based upon the laws and teaching of the Bible, has instilled morality, love of God, and the Ten Commandments into the everyday rights of British children. So you can see there that there's very much, like, he's not happy with the secularization of society. Oh, and one thing that's interesting is Bill, our good friend, well, not good friend at all, Bill, he didn't do it, but it's very common in this, like, yes, they very much point out how we got the sort of dating system of years, so they always write 2008 AD as opposed to just 2008. Next sort of property, so the third property is the cult of action for action's sake, which to take, this is one that actually I don't think they really do. They don't really seem to be calling for action, which is quite good. They are just sort of very much like just passively being bigots and complaining about things. I think the only mention of action that they said was when they sent, yes, here it is. This year, 33 Christians took part and worked as a team together. The Christians each wore a white garment with the Bible salvation text on their front and back. And this had happened at a procession of, well, about 30, this was sort of just people handing out the Bible and talking about the gospel to people at the Gloucester, there we go, Gloucester, the Gloucestershire Carnival processions. I apologise, I just lost my ability to say words then. But yes, they 33 people went to the Gloucestershire Carnival procession, and yes, even out of those 33, only 12 of them were actively going out and giving Bibles out and stuff. Apparently only 4 individuals requested a Bible, and they apparently had some useful conversations. So you can see they're not just acting in like a very violent thing. This may be because, as I sort of noticed, the Tommy Robinson and sort of other sort of fascist movements very much involved young disenfranchised men, whereas these are usually quite old people. So, apparently, yes, there were 2 young mums, so that's the one mention. And that's, yeah, the only young people. And then apparently they had a fish and chip supper. So, okay. So yes. Oh, yes, this is something, again, appealing to the second point. Again, the rejecting of modernism is for some reason, they have a rant about the metric system. I'll just read it out, it's a short paragraph, but the time has come when we must restore our British heritage. We must revert back to using British weights and measures rather than the secular, Napoleonic metric measurements which were forced upon us by the EU and homegrown traitors, Edward Heath, etc. One of our biggest overseas market, the USA, has always used BW&M and continues to use them. So, yes, apparently this could even fall into the cult of tradition, the first point, because apparently us revising our systems of measurements has destroyed our British heritage. Uh-oh. I feel bad laughing about this, because it is quite scary that people honestly believe this. But I believe that sort of we can take a sort of light-hearted thing to sort of keep our own morale up, and because I don't actually see the Christian soldiers as a threat. As I said, it's mostly a bunch of very old religious people. I think the oldest person I've seen mentioned here is in their 90s, and they, as sort of said by the Cult of Action for Action's sake, they're not actively acting. We can kind of counter this, and I feel like mockery is a good way to counter it. It's also because it's it looks like it was made by dragging clip art onto a Word document, and it's in an ugly pink thing, and all of the pictures are clip art. Oh, and their logo's made out of the shapes on PowerPoint. With the exception of the sword, which they've worked very hard to put behind the cross. So yes, I think this really shows, though, with them not really having the third point. We can still see how things can be fascistic even though they don't have all of these properties, and we can see if this was this is backing UKIP, which is appealing more to the younger generation. So, this could actually, encourage, their sort of encouragement of the younger generation in gaining more support for UKIP, because that's the main thing, probably. A lot of these people, I feel, might be doing a class character analysis. I don't feel like many people supporting UKIP are going to be financially vulnerable people, so they may have a lot of spare funds which they can then use to fund the more sort of violent elements of society, and their fascist sort of friends in UKIP. Their support for Nigel Farage might actually lower that, because it seems Nigel Farage trying to distance himself from the more violent fascists, though I can't actually see him decrying it or anything, and I don't actually think that is something to be too safe. The only reason he's distancing himself is because it's become obvious, and he is very much a right-wing person. The only mention of people who are sort of not of this upper-class thing is a 19-year-old who's mentioned they're very disabled and housebound, though they may be disabled and housebound as a result of age, unfortunately, as opposed to... Well, I wouldn't wish bad conditions on anyone, but disabled and housebound, and I feel like if they're in that situation, they wouldn't be supporting Nigel Farage, because he's very much in favour of privatising the NHS, and if you are housebound and disabled and 90 years old, I don't think privatising the NHS is something that you'd want unless you can afford it. But anyway, the next fourth point is disagreement is treason. This is very much a thing that has came up, like in the 2017 conference, the literature they had there was very much accusing Christians who voted Remain of being traitors, and if we look here in this newsletter that I have in front of me, yes, Pastor Lee Potter has written a letter to send out to MPs, and he very much, he accuses essentially of, yeah, I'm trying to find a good quote, though. I'll try and just plug random quotes from it. Unfortunately, you are all so far from doing God's will that all of the people have lost the honour and respect that is due to your office because of your despicable behaviour. And then I think there was maybe another quote, again, with the thing. So that's just a letter there. And then he has like a little prayer thing where he asks, he suggests that the MPs pray to thing. But yeah, I think maybe the random rant about the weighing system might be quite a good thing. Like, for example, yeah, they straight up say traitors. The secular Napoleonic metric measurements which were forced upon us by the EU and the homegrown traitors. So you can see here that they're very much... Anyone who sort of disagrees with them is a traitor to Britain and to Christianity. There's the fear of difference is the fifth property of fascism, and that's very much... sorry, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of words. I apologise. I don't edit these and just ramble, so you have to listen to me say I apologise again and again. But here we are. They very much are xenophobic and Islamophobic. For example, in a thing saying why Christians should vote to leave the European Union, they say, let's find it. Two of the points they give is the EU makes it easier for terrorists. The Muslim terrorist attacks in London, Paris and Brussels show that we face a global terrorist threat. If Britain does not regain control of our borders and our country, and particularly our cities, they will become less safe for us and our children. And then the next point in that is the EU prevents us controlling immigration. And then to speak from that, it mentions overcrowding, the pollution of land, the rivers and the sea. And then it's apparently an intolerable burden on schools, hospitals, jobs and housing and waging. So yes, it's very much fear of the thing. And then there's the next where it talks about the phony crime of Islamophobia, their words, not mine. This is actually a golden quote to demonstrate this. For there is no such thing, so start quote, for there is no such thing as Islamophobia. A phobia is an irrational fear, but there is nothing irrational about being afraid of the Islamic barbarism which is currently committing slaughter on 4 continents. So yes, you can see that they very much have a fear of difference. The next point is number 6 is the 6th property being appeal to a frustrated middle class. This one is again, I think, one that they don't sort of go into because they're appealing more so to the upper classes and then maybe the upper middle classes who are not financially sort of, or facing economic pressure from the demands and aspirations of lower social groups. Though, as an upper one, and then facing lower social groups' economic pressure, that very much might be why many of these people are supportive of UKIP. Because, yes, they very much are opposed to nationalisation and socialism. Yes, so the next bit is, and this is where I think it's the most sort of obvious and the most strongest of the properties that they have, is obsession with a plot and the hyping up of an enemy threat. This often combines an appeal to xenophobia with a feel of disloyalty. This is very much prominent, where their plot is sort of the EU is sort of destroying us, and the EU the EU is sort of, those who support the EU are also destroying our thing, along with everyone else who is supporting secularization, multiculturalism, pluralism, and things like that in the EU. They quote the BBC quite a lot. They notice, and the BBC and other things, as having a left-wing bias, and for reporting on things that they would want reported on differently in a unfavourable manner, according to their sort of view. And I think it's a bit silly to argue that the BBC has a left-wing bias. They're centrists, like, they're not far-right, or as right-wing as maybe the American media, but they're very, very, very not left-wing. For example, like, in their recent reporting of the Bolivian military coup, they do not mention the military coup. They make it sound as if the president of Bolivia peacefully stood down after people went out and protested. They do not mention the military at all. But the main thing is sort of the EU. That's their main target, and then of course the prime minister, the ministers, and those who support the EU. But where is it? Yeah, under the why Christians should vote to leave the European Union, they note that the EU is a new, ungodly, satanic Fourth Reich in the making. And then again has the long list of the things that the EU is going into. And again, in the sort of quote about the metric system, they specifically say that the EU's forced things upon us, and there's homegrown traitors sort of allowing things to be ruined by the EU. And then they... Yes, so, yeah, I think I will move on to the next point. Oh, it might be worth noting that fascism isn't always necessarily anti-Semitic. Like, they do place a thing where they talk about... Well, they're very much anti-Nazi, because they constantly compare the EU to Nazis. And they do actually have, like, a little segment where they talk about why anti-Semitism's on the rise. They actually don't comment on it, they just say that it's on the rise. So, from the way they talk, I think it would be unfair to say that they are anti-Semitic, but it is possible that they were putting it there as something to be proud of, though I'm not too sure. And it is important to note that fascism isn't necessarily anti-Semitic, as, for example, Mussolini, like, his fascism, it only became anti-Semitic after he began dealing with Hitler. That was a gradual thing. When it started, it wasn't strongly anti-Semitic, though anti-Semitism does often then play into it. Now, with the next few points, I will sort of skip them, because I think, again, fascism, it doesn't require that that they have all the properties, or that any properties can necessarily define something as fascistic, and we can see that it's already had many of them, of these properties. So, the the next one I'll move on to is machismo, which is the sort of the idea that they have this very strong sort of idea on sexuality, and this is unfortunately shown by their reactions to homosexual people. Like, for example, UKIP had to sort of distance itself after they made homosexual thing, and they have a little letter saying that yes, so they say that to quote, Disney has caved to the pressure of the radical LGBT lobby and started indoctrinating our children and grandchildren with a totalitarian gender ideology. So you can see that that's quite bad, and they have a section called, I think it's the next page. Homosexuality is a sin, but there is hope of forgiveness. God is the ultimate and sovereign... so it says, homosexuality is a sin by his order, referring to God. And, yes, and the next bit is, again, God, another paragraph reads, God's word says that homosexuality is unnatural, a perversion, an abomination, fornication, vile affections, and a great sin against him. And then they then even go against sex outside of marriage by saying, sex is he states that any sexual act outside of marriage is adultery, hetero or homosexual. Sex is to be between man and woman within marriage. They don't take the sort of all homosexuals have to die thing, but they have, there is absolutely hope for homosexuals, but again, this is in sort of, they must repent or die. So it's not very pleasant. They are nonces. I shouldn't say nonce unless I'm sure that nonce isn't bad. I apologise if nonce is an offensive word. I'm going to refrain from saying nonce in the future until I'm sure that it's not too bad. I'll call him a ding-dong, as Fortsline does. Right, and then they're also very much anti-abortion, and they have a little list for an abortion event that has passed. The next sort of bit is maybe, it's the next point. So machismo was the 12th point. So, yes, so points through from after 7 until 12, they don't really apply that strongly. But number 13 is selective populism, which is the people conceived monolithically have a common will distinct from and superior to the viewpoint of any individual. So, again, this isn't really mentioned too strongly, but they say they're very much in the view that it is very populistic in the thing. I think I'll read a letter from Matthew Ray, which sort of demonstrates this. I'll read part of it. I'm aware that some Remainers are saying, well, those who voted didn't really know what they are voting for, actually implying that over 17 million voters are stupid. The fact is, we don't want to be ruled over by a totalitarian oligarchy who will slowly drain us of every resource, where they would who will surely join us of every resource, where there would surely be consequences for those who would dare to refuse to comply with their New World agenda. So, again, you can see, they're sort of saying, all 17 million Leave voters are of the same mind, of the same will, and that there's more, their will is superior to the Remainers and everyone else, and the traitors in Parliament, and the traitorous Remain voters, and the other views. And again, this falls into the cult of tradition, where they sort of talk about, the rejection of modernism, as they talk about the New World agenda, and it's very much unfortunate. And then the 14th point is Newspeak, and I don't think that applies too strongly. If I was being pedantic, I could finally find a thing where they start saying political correctness for anything that's for any sort of opposing ideology. Ideology. But yes, so I think that sort of demonstrates how fascist Ur-Fascism. I hope Ur-Fascism's been explained in part. I'd recommend you read the essay, the 1995 essay. You can find it freely online. And I just wanted to show how like fascist elements are strongly part of UKIP, and they can come from different directions, and these sort of elements, they all contribute and accumulate together. Thankfully, UKIP's essentially failing now, and the alt-right has decreased in popularity. But we have to see, by sort of learning, identifying the elements of fascism, can make us more prepared to deal with it. And we should definitely always strive to get rid of fascism. Thank you for watching, and smash the fash.